Thank you. So this is a first stab at trying to explain some of the lessons I think that we can learn from the practice of Lectio Divina in order to apply them to secular reading, or in our case, secular teaching. So I'd like to kind of rehearse a little bit of the history of Lectio Divina, define the term more formally, and then give some suggestions for how we can conceptually apply that and even practically apply that in our own teaching other students to read, and not just to read, but to read well. So to start off, what is Lectio Divina? Well, the phrase is a Latin phrase, and in the way we use it, we take it from the rule of Benedict. Of course, at a Benedictine university, this is something that should be quite familiar to us and, right in our own normal set of practices. Prior to St. Benedict, many had used the phrase Lectio Sacra, which refers to the same thing, sacred reading or divine reading, we might translate into Latin. But sometimes when we look at the different ways that people phrase it, we realize that the phrase refers both to the specific text, like a sacred reading, the Bible, and also to the method or the practice of reading in a sacred way, or reading in a divine way, or you might even think reading with the divine or reading with the sacred. And that's very important for us to consider. The phrase always has at least two meanings, I think. One, the particular text, and two, the method. So as a specific text, Lectio Divina or Lectio Sacra refers directly to Scripture. That is the sacred or the divine text. As a method, there are multiple related traditions, and sometimes when we just Google the method of Lectio Divina, we come up with conflicting information. So we'll run through some of the history of that to kind of adopt a definition of Lectio Divina, and then we can apply that to what it would mean to do like a Lectio Saecula or something secular reading. Now, the earliest uses of the term or definitions of the tradition or method for reading Scripture is really rooted in Origen and Clement of Alexandria, but they're standardized in the tradition in St. John Cassian. John Cassian is born in the 4th century and dies in the 5th century, and he travels the entire known world. So he's one of those figures that just has experience everywhere, and therefore is able to synthesize quite a lot. Cassian is particularly relevant for us because he is a significant, explicit, and obvious source for St. Benedict. St. Benedict refers to Cassian explicitly, two of his texts at the end of Benedict's rule, and says, "I'm just a beginning. If you want the real stuff, go read Cassian." In other words, if there's something that's ambiguous in Benedict, one way to clarify it or to seek more information about it would be to read Benedict's sources, and he's already told us Cassian and Basil the Great are the two that he recommends. All right, so let's take a look at Cassian, and I have a handout here. We'll post it to the chat and other file forms if you want. It's somewhere on the order of a dozen pages from Cassian in his Conference 14, where he defines the term. You may want to take a look at that as I'm summarizing parts of it. For Cassian, Lectio Sacra is deeply related to the nature of Scripture and to the life of virtue. The nature of Scripture is important to understand because both the ancient and the contemporary Catholic understanding of Scripture is different from what many in other denominations and other world religions assume about a sacred text. I'll think of a modern text now. Pope Benedict XVI explained in one of his letters, Verbum Domini, the word of the Lord, Christianity is not a religion of the book, but rather a religion of the Word of God, who is the second person of the Trinity. Christians are not people of the book subjected to a text. Christians are people who belong to the Word, the Logos, Jesus Christ. That's why we're Christians, not texts or scriptures or something like that. So we have scriptures, but those are all rooted in the second person of the Trinity. Or to put it another way, the Catholic reads Scripture in order to encounter God the Word, God the Spirit, and God the Father. And this is different from reading a text which is simply inspired. Something that's inspired gives us, the message from the person or some ideas, but we're saying Scripture gives us access to God. Or to put it another way, if we think about what Scripture is, like essentially a collection of stories about salvation history, God's revelation in time, we'd have to say God writes the story of salvation first in human lives, then in stories about those lives and deeds. So when we read Scripture, we're not reading for the words on the page, but we're rather reading to encounter the same God who inspired Abraham and Sarah to set out, who called Moses, who met Moses at the burning bush, who gave the Ten Commandments. We're reading in order eventually to be face to face with Christ in some important way. Now, two implications of this are important for our study. First, Lectio Divina is only possible with sacred Scripture as our text. Second, there are multiple layers of meaning to be found in Scripture. If we're dealing with a text, that gives us access to the Word of God and talks to us about God's deeds in human lives throughout history, there's going to be more than one meaning in those words. Now, for the sake of the historical record, Cassian is also very significant on this point because Cassian is the first to explain the fourfold senses of Scripture which have become fundamental to Christian exegesis. And you may remember these from your previous studies, but we often talk about the literal and the spiritual, if we break them into two, or the traditional four are the literal, the moral, the allegorical, and the anagogical senses. And if you look at someone like Origen prior to Cassian, there are three main senses that he talks about. And you look at other people, there may be 5 or 6, and so there's some distinctions on the terms. It's Cassian who kind of outlines the fourfold schema, and then that's what becomes standard later and what we talk about today in most Christian exegetical traditions. Because the texts that we often teach as professors are secular texts and not the sacred text, the possibilities related to the nature of Scripture are different, but there are parallels between reading the sacred text well and reading other texts. So perhaps there's not moral, allegorical, anagogical meanings in the text that we write. Perhaps they do not give us direct access to God the Trinity. Nevertheless, the fundamentals of reading seem to me to be the same. All right, I said earlier there were two main things for Cassian that we wanted to consider that were relevant for us. The first was the nature of Scripture. The second is the life of virtue. Cassian explains a fundamental pattern that is important for us as educators. Development in virtue follows a twofold pattern, and Lectio Divina as a method helps us develop that pattern of virtue. First, there is what Cassian refers to in Greek as the practicae. And Cassian's writing in Latin, but using a Greek term. That should signal to us that the term does not mean simply what it sounds like in the cognate, right? Like if you're going to go to pains to quote it in a foreign language, the semantic field of the term is something greater than what you can express in a single term in the language that you're speaking or writing. All right, so the practicae, which is then followed by the theoreticae. And for Cassian, these stages are more involved than the simple terms practical and theoretical suggest, but that would certainly be a place to start. And Cassian's point is that you must master the practical knowledge of reading Scripture before you can master the theoretical. The same holds true for reading a secular text. We have to help our students do the practicae and do it well before we could expect them to have anything like theoreticae. And we know this to be true. We're just reminding ourselves of good reading practices in general. For Cassian, the practical includes the fundamental skills of being literate and dedicated to studies, as well as the ethical commitments to turn away from vice and begin the path of virtue. Now, this is a point where we often get confused, and so it's helpful to look at the more ancient sources. For Cassian, you have to become holy. You have to turn away from vice, get rid of your hang-ups, and you have to become a stable individual. You have to be seeking holiness and, in some sense, achieving holiness before you can even understand the literal meaning of Scripture. Again, I think there's a lot of import for our work as professors, even if we're only teaching secular texts. Now, sometimes this is controversial. I think there are theorists who assume that we can get the theory first before we get the practice, but I think Cassian is correct on this sequence in broad terms. If you're not literate, if you do not know how to read, then I cannot just keep giving you books. And that includes if you do not have the patterns of study. If you cannot sit still and read for 20 minutes, then when I give you a 40-minute reading assignment, you're going to fail. And then when I give you a test based on the 40 minutes of reading, asking for something like the moral meaning of the text, it's going to be a complete and total failure. The breakdown is at the level of the practicae, is what Cassian is saying. That means we have to pay attention to formation in virtue, formation in the practical arts, before we turn to the theoretical, but more on that later. For now, I'd like to just close the loop on our historical presentation concerning the various meanings of Scripture and then the theoreticae and practicae distinctions. As one masters the practicae, according to Cassian, she understands the literal meaning of the text. As one advances beyond basic virtue, beyond practicae, she begins to understand the other meanings of the text. So the moral, the allegorical, and the anagogical meanings are premised on the literal meaning, but they're also premised on development in practicae, even some sense of mastery of virtue. Again, I think this is directly relevant to our work as professors because we may fall prey to a sequencing mistake if we ask for theoretical knowledge or engagement prior to helping our students establish practical knowledge. The practicae for Cassian also includes the virtue of zealousness for study. And there's a great etymological point here. In Cassian's Latin, the word for student is studium. I mean, that's the root of our English word anyway, student, studium. But studium means zeal. It means a passion to attack your studies, to be immersed in them. And so there's a very important sense in which, as we're developing the practicae in ourselves, which we all have as established professors, but we're developing it in our students, we have to help them have a real zeal simply for being students. Not just a functional, can I get to the bottom of the page, can I pass the quiz, but that passionate virtue that says, I want to apply myself to learning and to developing. Practicae also includes memorization of the text. And this is key for Cassian's method. He says it multiple times. You can see it in the handout. You read and you memorize before you understand. The memory comes into play, if for nothing else, then that you have to be able to recite the text in unison with other people. Right? Communication, we have to memorize the terms we're going to use so that as we're talking, we have a productive conversation. I cannot constantly be looking at my dictionary to figure out what you mean. Same with reading a text. But then also, you have to be able to roll over the text in your own thoughts. And so memory allows you to be independent from the page. And the idea here is you read something in the morning, and then you think about it all day long. Or in our pattern for teaching, you read something on Monday and think about it and sleep on it. And then we talk about it on Tuesday. And then you continue to hold that in your memory while you read something for Thursday. And so there's this progressive building or layering, and memory is very important. And it's something that's lost today, I think, especially in our internet age, especially in the ability to access all of our texts online and to search them and use computers in the place of our memory. We very well might be stalling the practical and therefore never allowing the theoretical in the the lessons we're learning from the ancient practice of Lectio Divina. All right, we could summarize Cassian's pattern for reading well. First, one must turn away from vice and turn towards virtue. Second, one must have all the practical skills associated with reading, and that includes virtue. Third, one must memorize the text. Fourth, after applying oneself as a practical student of the text, one may advance to higher theoretical understanding that includes moral, anagogical, and allegorical meanings. Historically, I'm willing to argue that we can assume this is the basic sense Saint Benedict had when he spoke of Lectio Divina. He's thinking explicitly of Cassian's Conference 14 and what this means for a pattern. And that's relevant because Benedict never says, here's the method for Lectio Divina. He just says, do it. And here are the different times and ways that Lectio Divina will play out. So let's turn to Benedict and look at a few additional connections that Benedict makes explicit. And here again, I have a handout with just a few selections from the Rule of Benedict, and we'll make that one available. It's got Rule of Benedict 4 and 48 in it. Those are the two relevant points, not the only ones, but the two I want to address today. Out of the connections that Benedict makes, I think that are really important. First, reading is work, and it's work that is both physical and intellectual. So the selections that you've got there, and if you've read all the Rule of Benedict, this is painfully obvious to you. Reading happens not simply when one is reading alone, as we often think of it. I'm quiet, please everybody else be quiet, I'm going to sit in my comfortable chair, and I'm going to engage a text only with my eyes. That's not actually reading, or at least it's not the fullness of reading. Reading also happens when we're reading together with others, like when we're reading aloud, when we're reciting psalms together in the choir in the church. And reading happens when one listens to something read to him. This is coming back in vogue these days with audiobooks, podcasts, and the things that can be listened to, what we used to call lectures. That is a kind of reading, which again engages all of the practical skills, including memorizing what is being said to you. Now, Benedict lists, sacred reading or divine reading, specifically with that verb to listen to divine reading in Rule 4. And Rule 4 is titled The Tools of Good Works. Right? So listening to sacred reading is a tool for learning virtue. Again, this is Cassian's framework. In order to learn virtue, in order to develop, one thing you have to do is begin to read Scripture well, to memorize Scripture well, to be studious with your practice of reading. Now, if you look at Rule 4 in a little more detail, you'll note that the list of tools is essentially quotations from Scripture, beginning with the Decalogue. And in a certain way, this reaches a climactic point with the favorite commandment in our abbey. Your way of acting must be different from the world's way. The love of Christ must come before all else. This quotation is actually painted on the wall, sort of the lintel, on a doorway in the Abbey Chapel. It's the one that leads out to the east of the chapel. It's quoted there. In other words, one must master the practicae, the 10 Commandments, learning that your way of acting must be different. It must be motivated by the love of Christ. One must master the practicae in terms of turning away from vice and becoming virtuous as the first steps of Lectio Divina. Only later, in the same Rule 4, does Benedict tell us, listen readily to holy reading and devote yourself to prayer. Again, Lectio Divina includes not simply private reading, but also the more public reading or praying together of Scripture, and also the practice of listening to or receiving the word spoken to us. The theoretike comes only after the practicae of living the 10 Commandments in love and devoting ourselves to listening to the word. Rule of Benedict 48, also on the handout, is essentially the locus classicus for the phrase Lectio Divina. Benedict says, idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brothers should have specified periods for manual labor as well as for prayerful reading. And the phrase in Latin there is Lectio Divina. But we have to note that Lectio Divina is part of this rule, which Benedict calls the opera manuum quotidiana, the daily work of the hands, or the manual work of the hands, right? The manuum. And we have to think here, in order to read, you must use your hands. You have to open the book. You have to turn on lights, right? You have to sit in a particular way. It's physically demanding, actually, to read. And I mean, we know this older in life, like, back pain can keep you from reading, right? Like it is a physical kind of thing. But we have to pay attention to that, I think, when we're forming our students to read well. The manual labor of reading includes turning off your phone and turning off Netflix and quieting things and clearing off your desk and, like a whole physical posture, orienting yourself towards the text. It also involves the senses. And in Benedict's day, to read was to mutter aloud. And we do this when we read a foreign language. A lot of times I just cannot get the sense of something in French when I'm reading it on the page. So I say it out loud, and then I'm like, oh, I hear it. I see what's happening here. Well, everyone in the ancient world read aloud, even when reading alone, mumbled the words to get the sense of the grammar in the sentence. But also in Benedict, we hear the kind of famous summary of Benedict: to work and to pray, or pray and work, ora et labora. And the whole point of Benedictinism is that those two should not be separated. So you need to find ways to overlap them, that what appears to be work is prayer, and you have to work at praying. The idea is to be able to do them together. Note again here the importance of memorizing the text. It's impossible to continue to reflect upon Scripture or reflect upon a conversation while you're tilling the fields if you have not memorized those words. All right, I'd like to turn away from Benedict now. Obviously, there's more to say about Cassian. Obviously, there's more to say from Benedict, but we want to march on through our kind of rapid sequence of about 1,000 years and get to a more formal definition of the process of Lectio Divina. Everyone speaks of Lectio Divina, but very few people define it in a tight, narrow sense until the medieval schoolmen. And I mean, that's part of the joy of studying the scholastics, right? They're very concerned to condense things and express them aptly and succinctly. And it's in that context where we get narrow and precise sets of stages. And there's debate. I don't want to mislead you about that. But there's one line of thought that comes to dominate the Benedictine tradition. And that's the line of thought that comes out of Guigo the Carthusian in his Scala Paradisi. And I have a handout there from Guigo as well. And that's just a few selections out of his, ladder to paradise, the Scala Paradisi, or the ladder for monks. Now, all of the principles that we've been discussing from Cassian and Benedict apply in that the ladder Guigo describes as both a ladder of virtue and a ladder of reading. Guigo's explicit comment is, I was reading, and I realized the process of reading for 20 minutes is the same process for 20 years that's playing out in my life. And so pursuing holiness or being lifted, climbing the ladder to paradise is something that happens in the kind of the microcosm and the macrocosm of my life. All right, so what is that pattern? The process that Guigo is describing, the ladder of virtue and the ladder of reading, is one of transformation in grace, as well as a kind of descriptive lens for any process of reading. And Guigo lists 4 stages. I'll give them to you in Latin, again, because they mean more in the text than we might understand if we just gave them a simple translation in English. All right, so the 4 stages that Guigo lists: Lectio, Meditatio, Oratio, and Contemplatio. Now again, there are plenty of others who have different stages. One very common alternative is Hugh of St. Victor, who's several generations earlier than Guigo, he had suggested the same 4 stages, but had included a stage of performance between oratio and contemplatio. In other words, Victor thought that after you did the reading, the meditating, the oratio, kind of a grateful prayer, you needed to then experience something, do something, before you could come to the contemplative understanding, the theoretike. In recent days, many prefer to speak of Guigo's 4 and then note that the action follows the contemplatio, right? That the pattern is, once I have a deeper theoretical understanding, I return to the action. That's Plato's allegory of the cave. Once you become a philosopher, you go back to the bottom and help people out. That's the 5 steps that you'll see in something like Pope Benedict the 16th's Verbum Domini. There are others, particularly within the Benedictine tradition, that notice a prior stage, like a 0, before the Lectio. And that's this practice of statio, standing. And that's really meant to recognize, one, that when you join any community, there is a kind of order, not just a rank structure, but, everyone sits in the same place, that we have these familiar relationships. And all of that is our standing in the community. That is the background to any new reading. If we've already learned the language, reading is different from 2 years ago when we were trying to learn the language. Or if we're taking a senior level class, we've got statio. We've got the first 3 years of learning behind us. And so often you'll see people put that statio as a first stage or a prior context. That includes the life of virtue, and it precedes or surrounds Guigo's 4 stages. All right, those are the 5 I've listed in a final handout that's called A Few Remarks on Lectio Divina. So Guigo's traditional 4 come after that general Benedictine statio. And I've given you there on that handout a description of what those terms mean within the tradition, right? Essentially what it would mean to pray and to speak with Scripture. But then also another column on that handout which begins to do what I really want to do for our session with faculty development, think about how we apply those stages to reading. And I'll say this is a handout I've used with students for several years, particularly in seminars. I'll hand this out in the first or second week and go back over the syllabus briefly with my method for teaching or my method for running seminar, and just try quickly and briefly to make the point that I think this is a fundamental pattern for learning, for reading, and so invite the students to think at that meta level about their own process. All right, so let's talk explicitly about how to apply these lessons learned from the ancient practice of Lectio Divina to our teaching, particularly our teaching secular reading, where maybe we're not developing complete virtue and holiness in order to get people to heaven, but we're doing something that should approximate that at a Benedictine university. I think the first observation is that sequence is terribly important. To go to Cassian's terminology, practicate, then theoretike, right? That we make a lot of mistakes when we ask students for what would correspond to the theoretike. We ask students for the moral meaning. We ask students for the anagogical or the allegorical meanings, and they have not done the literal level. And they've not done the literal level because we've not set them up to memorize the text. We've asked them to glance at a text and do something else, right? Or one thing I get from a lot of my students is, they think that I somehow lack the answer to my own question. And so what I'm doing is asking them a question, and I'd like them to Google it and find the answer. And then when they found the answer, the one little piece of datum, this happened on that day, that they've helped me out or they've solved the problem. And it's like, no. I gave you this question because I wanted you to work through the problem, right? I want you to apply yourself to this. Again, what we've done, I think, is we've short-circuited the cycle and we've asked for something approximating theoretike in Cassian's terms, which is completely inappropriate. Like, it was just a bad question on our part or a bad demand. All right. We note in Guigo's theory or description of it, right? That the Lectio, the close, careful reading and memorization is the fundamental layer. It's the first step. That's what allows meditation. And so anytime we're doing assignments, we're thinking about forming students, and we're not asking them actually to read and to read carefully, we're short-circuiting the process. And according to this theory, we're sort of foolish to expect that students would get to a meditatio. And here's a sequence I've seen over and over and over again. I show up to class, I assume everybody's read very well, and then I start asking a question based on my own meditation on the text. Well, my own meditation on the text is like at least 20 years longer than my students, right? This is not the first time I've read this. And then a student says something which is effectively random for the student, and I assume that's the super higher order knowledge, and then the whole class gets stuck talking about that. I'm derailed from helping my students actually practice Lectio, the reading. And I'm already having a conversation with myself about, the contemplatio or the oratio or the meditatio, and nobody can learn from it because I'm at the wrong stage. Or perhaps one student really has done that work and the rest have not. And so in our group work in class, we forget to go back to the basic level and reread the text and teach the students to actually read well. We force them to memorize by engaging others, right? By speaking this aloud without reference to other texts. And then, the whole project fails essentially because of a sequence mistake. All right. Practicae before theoreticae, Lectio before meditatio. Sequence is terribly important. We talk a lot these days about Bloom's taxonomy, and I think Bloom makes the same point. In fact, there's something else going on here that we forget about Bloom's taxonomy when we get excited about it. We realize in our quick study already, I think, that our ancient and medieval Benedictine ancestors realized you cannot separate what Bloom calls the cognitive domain from the psychomotor domain. Reading is a physical practice. It's manual labor. And all the time we think about trying to build our courses or our assignments simply in terms of the cognitive domain. But in fact, the psychomotor and really the affective might be prior in a very important sense. They're certainly all together. We separate them to our own demise and in essence as teachers. When we separate them or when we focus only on the cognitive domain, we forget this Benedictine wisdom that the affective and the psychomotor domains are important. The statio is important. Your relation in the community is a very important context and precursor to how you build. Your virtue is the prerequisite for reading Scripture, as well as your basic knowledge of the terms, reading the language, understanding the grammar. All right, this is all the more important as we face a new generation of students who are less stable. They're less stable in what Bloom calls the affective domain. Many of them are less stable in the psychomotor domains. The actual process of getting out a book, laying it out on a desk, organizing just the physical space is a skill that I think a lot of our students lack. And I often forget this because it seems second nature to me. All right, so these basic study skills, or if we go to Cassian's terminology, the practicae. We've got to be paying attention to those fundamentals. Or in that later Benedictine sense, the statio, the standing. When our students are less developed, less confident in all of those domains, then, we should sort of expect struggle at that initial level, and we should meet them there. There's also a skill that I call like focused reading, right? Not being distracted, or commitment, the studium, right? The zealousness to stick with the text. And that's part of the practicae, and another thing where I think we often forget or miss the boat. that many of our students lack that studium. And part of what we need to do is help them develop that before we could expect anything at the more advanced level. And then finally in the practicae, without the active engagement of the memory, no one can advance beyond the entry level of reading any text. And I've thought about this a lot in my own teaching, the need to repeat, the need to sequence, answer the question with the book open, answer the question with the book closed. Work the problem with the paradigm in front of you, work the problem without the paradigm, work it until you have it memorized. That's an important part of the practicae. All right, more lessons learned. Pay attention to the statio of the students. Now, as professors, we're not in control of the overall life patterns of our students. Student affairs ought to be able to help us with that, right? I mean, it takes a much bigger thing. That's the point of living at college, right? We can help you live well in order to learn well. And so we want all of that to work together in the same way that it does, in monastic formation. That's the point of being a Benedictine school. All right, but we are, as professors, in control of the timeline. We are in control of the sequence. We're in control of how we stage the assignments in our class. And we can be gatekeepers for what we allow students to do and in what order. And I've found this very helpful for planning my own sense of what I want to accomplish in the class. I very well may need to do a whole lot of Lectio and nothing of Meditatio, nothing of Oratio, nothing of Contemplatio for the first 2/3 of my semester. I may simply be building careful, close readings of texts. Similarly, if I think of a 75-minute class period, 60 minutes may be devoted to solid Lectio, with only 15 minutes at the very end to Meditatio, Contemplatio, and Oratio. And the more I think carefully in those terms, the more it makes sense to me how to scaffold or how to structure a particular, period of teaching, a particular class period, a particular module within a course, a particular, semester course. And even when we think about our majors across 4 years, that, an intro seminar or an intro class should be different from a senior level class. And on this theory, we ought to be doing mostly Lectio, just close, careful reading at the beginning in order to allow our students to do the meditatio, to make the connections, and even to begin to express some things on their own. All right, another lesson learned to put in related terms, pay attention to the use of memory. And I think we really need to lean into requiring memorization. All right, inasmuch as we need students to perform at the level of Theoretica for college credit, we very well may have to just acknowledge that students are not ready to be evaluated at that level. All right, and so if I pegged this 200 level class to you must be able to articulate Meditatio, but you have fundamental problems at Lectio, then that's one sign that maybe we're misplaced. We also need to be attentive to when students present the fruits of mature Theoreticae, when they give us moral meanings, anagogical meanings, allegorical meanings. This almost always indicates cheating or plagiarizing at some point, right? And I mean, we know this, right? We're reading a paper and we're like, wow, that's really well done. I didn't come up with that idea until I was 35. How did you get it at the age of 19, right? I mean, we know this, but pay attention even in class discussions. In other words, we should not expect novices to have broad-ranging synthetic intellectual abilities. And when they submit such work or when they offer such an idea in class, then we need to take a step back and just ask the simple questions of, is this your own reading of the text? Show me where it is and how you got to it. All right. Quickly, I'll go through an individual class session, and then we're at time, and so I'd like to entertain some questions and hear your thoughts on this, because I know many of you also practice Lectio Divina. The stage of Lectio needs to be completed by individual students prior to a productive class session. They need to do their own reading, even to the point of memorizing the text or the main arguments. Advanced students may have begun their own meditatio, but I think we really do need to begin class with that collective reading. to push the students, to help them see things that they did not see in their own careful reading. That's what's going to allow the platform for us as teacher to moderate, facilitate, or present our own meditatio. And it's the Lectio which allows the student to engage the fruits of that meditatio. When done well, this is going to include a mechanism for students to engage their own meditationes, to add them to the conversation. But part of what we're actually showing in class is that there is an understanding of this material beyond the student's own first read of the material. In other words, I've assigned a text which deserves more than one reading, and class needs to help reinforce that I've circled back to this text multiple times, and there's a lot more going on here than any of us get the very first time we read it. We should be facilitating development in their ability to reflect on material well, and development in their understanding. And so class needs to move beyond their reading of the text last night if we're following the pattern of Lectio. A good meditatio ends with oratio, gratitude, recognition that what you've done is beyond your own ability. And so we need to work to get each class session, I think, to lead to some recognition of newness in our understanding and gratitude for that process of learning. That expression does not need to last long, but the gratitude and the recognition seems to be the premise for what leads to contemplatio, the experiential grasp of the truth. And if we don't mark that, I think we just do not facilitate development. Now, properly speaking, contemplatio cannot be expressed in human words. Our goal is to facilitate some experience of wonder at and rest in the beauty and goodness of the truth. If timed well, I think what this means is that the last 5 to 12 minutes of class should use an oratio type event to punctuate the shift to awe and amazement of contemplatio. And we want our students to leave class floating in the beauty of the truth that we've pursued in that 50 or 75 minutes. And then we want them to come back 2 days later and repeat the whole process.